I'm Margie Barron, and together with my co-host Michael Dribbin, I welcome you to our Season 1, Episode 3 of Being Mortal. It's a series based on a book of the same name, in which Rabbi Gary Glickstein will guide us in an intimate discussion on the realities of aging and making important end-of-life decisions through what's oftentimes difficult conversations. Tonight, we are grateful to have two members of our congregation share their own unique conversations with us, Jack Carson, a past president, and Ethan Grossman, a third-generation Temple member. So at this time, I'd ask you to all mute yourselves, and any questions or comments you have throughout the hour, please put them in the chat, and then we'll have time at the end of the hour to address them. This series is sponsored by the endowment of the Rabbi Gary Glickstein Foundation of Temple Beth Shalom and hosted by Generations. That's a designation, excuse me, that recognizes those of us who have been affiliated for more than 25 years. That continuity is a cornerstone of our strong community. Excuse me. Bad cough. I'm proud to count myself among them, and I know many of you do also. The Glickstein Foundation was created, as many of you know, and I'm going to take 1 minute because I'm coughing terribly. The Glickstein Foundation was created to ensure that our temple remains financially strong now and into the future. We have and are continuing to have a robust endowment, which means we can avoid substantial increases in our membership fees and our service fees. The endowment generates income through responsible investing of its principal and then provides a percentage of its interest from those investments to offset operating expenses of the temple. The foundation also houses a variety of named funds which supports initiatives and many scholarships that are aligned with the mission of the temple. It is a vehicle through which we can include temple in our estate planning to ensure a strong Jewish community for generations. Many of us have already done that. And speaking of resources, we have an abundance of wealth in our leadership. And these are the people who embrace the really hard work of getting all of this done. Please recognize Michael Weinberg, our philanthropy chair, Katie Boyask, our director of advancement, and Craig Burko, our technology and Zoom maven, who is recording this session. Thank you all. I'm so honored to introduce Rabbi Emeritus Gary Glickstein, who is a very welcome presence in our lives. Rabbi and Joni have had their own very personal and intimate conversations with family and have guided others through them. Thank you, Rabbi, for being with us and for offering this important program.
Thank you, Margie. Welcome, everybody. I thought Ethan was going to be the youngest here, but the two Carson boys are on here, and it's like another generation younger than even Ethan. So welcome to all of you. The portion of the week, I mean, it's always interesting when it falls. This one is called Bo, has some resonance with our new president. It's not the same as the name, but Bo is the portion for us, which has the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a people, not as families. In Genesis, we have 3 mitzvot, but they're given to our families, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to them, and then eventually we get them. But this one is the first one given to us as a people. And it's a calendar. It's established this month, the month of Nisan, as the first of months. And then, of course, that delineates Passover. They take the Paschal lamb on the 10th, and then the process begins. Now, up until then, we didn't have a structure, right? Basically, whatever we did, there were customs and traditions, but this established a structure that we know of as the Hebrew calendar, and we're familiar with throughout the year. We know, we can think about already, even though we're in early in the year, we're already thinking, some of us, about Pesach. Will we be able to gather this year since we didn't last year? Maybe it's possible for Shavuot, for the temple to hold something in the sanctuary this year. And then there's the high holidays. There's more the possibility that we may have some people in person. I mean, the calendar gives us that sense of structure. And I was thinking about that in relation to being mortal, because much of our lives, we have kind of a calendar in our own mind for what we want to get done. When we're young, we want our education. We want to think about what direction we want to take. We move into some form of job or profession or idea where we want to go, and then we begin building. We build family, we build career, we move into a home, maybe. We begin the process of accumulating, hopefully, some amount of money that will allow us to live the way we want to. And much of our life is designed along kind of a way of thinking, of structuring our lives. But many of us on this call have reached a different point, a point without a calendar, in the sense that we do know that we've reached that point where the end is in view. I mean, I don't know about you, when I read the obituaries, I look at the age of those who've died. I'm 73, and very often it's 78 or 81 or 84 or even 87. Well, I subtract those numbers. It's not hard. And I see where I'm headed. And also I know that for some people who head in that direction, they go through decisions of illness, of treatment, of various things they have to deal with, things that probably I will have to deal with. This process of talking about the end, talking about the process of what it means to begin facing that, is what being mortal really is about. That's what the book was about. It's what the process is. It's having the conversations with ourselves, with our partners, our spouses, if we have children, if we're so blessed, with them, with our physicians, if we have a lawyer, an accountant, with the people around us, to make sure we've thought through the kinds of things we want. In the book, Being Mortal, one of the issues that one of the people says is, when he's asked, what would be enough for you to stay alive and feel it was worthwhile? And he said, if I can sit on the couch and eat ice cream and watch a baseball game, that would be enough. Even if I didn't have anything else, if I'm enjoying ice cream and a baseball game, that would be enough. That would not be enough for me. I mean, I'm telling you right now, if that's all I got, I don't want to be there. So for me, if I'm headed in that direction, there are choices about treatment, about operations, about whether I take a medicine or not. All of those are not mandatory at this stage of life. We have to decide on what quality of life we want to try and achieve. We can't always do it. What happens when we no longer have control? Who is going to have control? And what instructions are we going to leave them about our desires at those moments? We don't want them to feel, whoever makes the decision, we don't want them to feel guilty, or worse, to be totally at odds with each other, maybe feeling they don't know because we've never said it. And then in the final time, what do I want after? Am I really worried about how I'm buried, where I'm buried, if it's a cremation or at sea? Issues like those kind of things, some of us will decide, some of us will leave it to those after us. But all of these issues are going to happen. That's the point. There are going to be these kinds of issues. And thinking about it, just like we earlier in our lives thought about what we wanted to achieve, thinking about it is the impetus for this kind of discussion. And even though it's not always comfortable and not always easy, I told the story, I think last time, that with my father, we never talked about it. We had no idea what he wanted, how he wanted. And he died, unfortunately, very young and kind of made some decisions and died suddenly. My mother actually told us what it was she wanted. If she couldn't live an independent life on her own, the way she'd lived for 87 years at that point, she didn't want to have any efforts made to bring her back. So my sisters and I were able to work with the people in palliative care, and my mother died peacefully when it was clear she couldn't come back. There was no operation, no procedure that would bring her back to independence. So that made it easier for us. There was less guilt about making that decision. We were on the same page about that. So I believe it's really essential and important that we do this, that we talk to people, we start with ourselves, and then we go through the process. So what we're going to do tonight is listen to two of our congregants, as you heard, who have dealt with some of these issues and are dealing with them, and they're going to talk about how they have approached this as a way of kind of helping us in thinking through this process. So since I'm 73, we're going to turn to the next generation first, which is Jack Carson. And then we're not going to go to the final generation. They're going to have to listen to their father. Come after Jack.
Well, so I should say thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Margie. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Katie, for organizing this. Really appreciate it. And I wanted to say hello to everybody. I know most of you. That's kind of exciting for me because, boy, do I miss going to a party. So I'm going to consider this to be our little party tonight, although the subject is a little more serious than what we would normally talk about at a party. And I do want to make one comment about Rabbi Glickstein's calendar. I'm not sure which side of the calendar I want to be on. So I'm not going to think about that right now because I know I'm getting there since I am 60 now. But I wanted to just tonight share with you a little bit about our journey, our family journey, and really where we've come and some of the decision making that's gone on in what we've done with our family. So really, the journey starts, and let's be honest, in the beginning, most of us think basically we are immortal. That's just the way it is. We don't think about a lot of this. I know in my case, I got married to Arden, who's on the screen there, and we started having children. And all of a sudden, believe me, I knew I was not immortal and had to start thinking about a lot of things in regard to what we did in our house and our home. And our family really practiced Judaism in a more, I would call it a practice doctrine as opposed to a belief one. We lived our covenant to God in what I would call a very traditional way. We followed Jewish tradition on how we prayed, how we celebrated holidays, how we conducted our work and businesses, of course, how we ate, how we treated others, and really how we viewed our mortality or our immortality. And the reality is, and I did do a little bit of research, but I was pretty focused on what I would call our covenant to God. And really, to me, there has always been more focus on life than death. And I did a little research, so I don't want to get it wrong, but when you read Deuteronomy, there's some discussion about the covenant really talks about a long and prosperous life. There's no reference to hell, heaven, or death. And Jewish tradition and beliefs do guide us when we think about our mortality. We want to live a good life, right? We poo-poo when we think of death. We just don't really want to discuss it. We can find it very difficult to discuss. And really, we think about embracing our life and living it to the fullest. And that's what we think of as living a Jewish life. But I think there's more to that. I really do. And I think as I talk about our family's journey, I do want to share something that we've always been very focused on. We've been very focused on a lasting social impact. And I think about this covenant to God with God where we get a lot and we give a lot. So for us, I want to just share some of the areas in philanthropy that we've been involved with. And I think then you'll get an idea about our family. And then I'm going to tell you exactly what we did for some of our planning. I grew up in Alabama, So my mom sent me to a Jewish camp to make sure I maintained my Jewishness. Well, that was all good. And the bottom line was we were so focused, and I found it to be so beneficial that we continued our focus on this camp and helped set up scholarships and made many contributions going forward. When I moved to Miami, I really wanted to do something a little bit different, and I ended up becoming a big brother. I was a big brother with the agency for over 10 years, was actually president of the organization, regular contributor, and ultimately, and this is why I bring it up, we established a planned gift for Big Brothers. Arden was very involved in Federation when we got married. We've been married 31 years. She's also a founding member of the Underline, which is another organization we're very committed to, and also left a planned gift. This will all come together in just a minute. And finally, as most of you know, because again, this is a party for me tonight, we've been very involved in the temple. And for the temple, we also ended up leaving a planned gift. So let's get now to the rest of the story. And let me tell you a little bit about what we've done and how we've done it. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't first, everybody can see that, I assume. I would be remiss if I didn't introduce my family. And I just wanted to share a very quick quote from the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. We achieve greatness by handing our values to the next generation and empowering them to go and build, essentially, l'dor v'dor. And as you can see here, this is my family. This was my son's bar mitzvah at the temple. This was my oldest son's wedding. And I want to just show these people to you because they're the reason that we ended up going on what I would describe as our Jewish journey. So 31 years ago, Art and I were married. Now that was great. And we had a real nice life. And we really thought of ourselves as immortal, so to speak. Didn't have many cares, had nice jobs, but very focused on what we were doing. Then all of a sudden we had all those children. And what became the most important point for us was what was going to happen with our children if something happened to us. And I'm being very honest with all of you. This is not something that's very comfortable to talk about. We were actually going on a trip, and my mom, who was alive at the time, was coming down to take care of the kids. And I think it was actually at the time just Jared and Micah were born then. And we scrambled to put a will in place so that not that we were worried about our assets, because believe me, we didn't have any back then. What we're really focused on was making sure our children were protected. And so we put that into place, gave no more thought to anything. And interestingly enough, my mom was actually the guardian for our children. Well, lo and behold, my mom ended up dying. She died very young. She was 58. She died of ovarian cancer. And now all of a sudden things had really changed. But I want to tell you a little bit about my mom's death, because we talked earlier, and Rabbi Glickstein talked earlier about everybody has a different situation. My parents had given absolutely no thought to what would happen if someone in my family died. My brother and my sister, at the time, my parents had moved to New Hampshire. They moved up there when I moved to Alabama, had no idea what was going on. My mom died. My dad didn't even know where the checkbook was. He had no idea how to pay a bill. He had no idea to do anything. More importantly, we had no idea what to do when somebody died. Pretty much of a struggle. And interestingly enough, I come back to the Jewish roots part of me. And although I wasn't affiliated up there and didn't know anybody up there, I ended up calling the rabbi who ran the congregation at the closest city to where they lived. And I got to tell you, he was very helpful. He was very understanding. He was very soothing. He came to talk to us, and he really helped us through the process. We didn't even know about the funeral home. We didn't know really about anything. And he was really great in helping us get through that process. And I look back and I think to myself, how could it be that no one knew anything about what was going on? The only thing we knew was that my mother had left a full freezer of food. And the most important part of this, and my mother used to buy food on sale, so the freezer ended up being full all the time. And the only thing I can really remember about that was my dad finding a turkey in the freezer that was 5 years old and insisting that we make it. And you know what? We did. I'm not going to say we ate it, but I am going to tell you that we made it. So that became very important in regard to who was going to be the guardian of our children and what we were going to do. Well, later on, actually this past year, I had a little bit of a health scare. I had a DVT and some pulmonary emboli, clots in my lungs, and things were a little bit crazy. And I share this because this is a whole different view of what's going on when you think about our mortality or immortality. Turns out it was pretty serious. I didn't really realize it when it happened. I ended up in the emergency room at Aventura, Mount Sinai. they put me in an ambulance and take me to Mount Sinai on the beach. Not the point of the story. And by the way, I'm fine. The interesting point of the story was every time I turned around, I was asked, who's my healthcare surrogate? Do I have a living will? Is it documented? What do I have? It was as if every time I turned around, from a doctor to a nurse to the ambulance, back into the regular hospital, that's what I was asked. I'm going to share with you what we did in just a minute. Now, the other thing we want to make sure we're considering is that, yeah, as Art and I have been married and we were together and raised our children, we did begin to develop some asset growth and personal earnings. And you've already seen, as I've explained in the beginning, what our commitment was to philanthropy. Now, I am going to tell a quick story about wills. I already mentioned to you we'd set up a will, but the funny part of that is so we've done a will 5 or 6 times, many different times for not a lot. And I want to make something very clear. It's a thoughtful process, not an obsessive process. My mother died, we had to make some changes. We had a 3rd child, we had to make some changes. We've ultimately decided that we want our oldest son, Jared, to be the guardian of our youngest daughter because there was a 10-year difference in age. Well, that's something that took a lot of thought to make sure it went through. And so we had to make some changes through generations as things changed in our lives. The interesting thing was, and just another funny story, the first time I pulled out our original will, I pulled it out, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I showed it to Arden, and I go to Arden, what were we thinking? We wrote this will as if we were millionaires. I'm not exaggerating. The kids get a third at 30 and a third at 35 and a third at 40. And let me tell you something, it was a third of nothing. Because we wrote that first will, there was nothing there. But it's very interesting the things we think about when we're going through this process. And I mentioned to you before, this was not something we'd ever discussed. My parents never discussed this with me. Arden's dad, who died a couple of years ago, never discussed anything with him. In fact, he hadn't even discussed much with his wife. So that's kind of interesting that the generation we're talking about before me really had very little discussion. Finally, we did discuss having some planned gifts and beyond, and really thinking about what it meant to give back, because we've been pretty fortunate, and I use the word we've earned what we've done, not deserved. I was a good term that Rabbi Glickstein helped me with the other day, but we really thought about what can we do to give back. So as we develop that process and take all that together, I put up this quick little slide because I talked about not having any value when we first got married and nothing really to be inherited. Well, now we have a lot of toilet paper, thanks to the pandemic. And let's be honest, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the pandemic certainly has had an effect on all of us. No matter what it is, I think a lot of us have been more down, we've been sadder, and we probably have thought a little bit more about death because we're more concerned that the virus impact may affect us directly. And we all know people that have been affected directly by the pandemic. My daughter-in-law's grandfather died from the virus a couple of weeks ago. So we understand that, and it's something to think about. But hopefully, we're not going to make it where it's the obsessive thing that goes forward. Now, I've given you a little bit of background. I just want to tell you what our strategy's been. We do have a will in place. Like I said, this is probably the 5th iteration of that will. We also have a living will. We have healthcare surrogates, and we're very clear about what we have in place. We also set up a donor fund so that we can actually work with our children. And again, it's not that much money. The point is not the value or the amount, it's the process. So we've set this up so that our children can be involved in what we do and who we support and what we think are important in terms of when we think about the future and we think about what we want to do for our social impact. We also set up revocable trusts. Interestingly enough, not about the money, it's about the ease of access that our children would have if they needed something, if they need the house, if they need the car, if they need some money. All that will be available because we've set up revocable trusts that are much easier to do. Now, we also thought it was very important that we communicate the process. So after Lily turned 18, and that was really the time of reckoning, so to speak, we needed to sit down and discuss with the kids what we had done. And part of that was we wanted to make sure that Lily, who was still in college, no matter what happened, always had the means and the wherewithal to pay for her college education. We then put in some planned gifts and thought about what do we want to do for our own legacy. And interestingly enough, as organized as I sound and as efficient as I may be, Art and I actually have not made our final death plans. We talk about it a lot. We just haven't. We don't have burial plots. We haven't said where we're going to be or what we're going to do. And frankly, that will be the next step of this journey, so to speak. Something that we've talked about and something that frankly, nobody wants to talk about. And a couple of my kids are here on this call. They don't want to hear about it, but we want to make sure it's something that we take care of, because we think it's very important when you think about going from generation to generation and Lador Vador. So I mentioned to you, these essentially are our planned gifts where we are now. That may change, it may not change. And really the point is not that they're just planned gifts. The point is we've thought about this journey. And I come back to that covenant with God, where we want to live our life to the fullest. And that means we want to get a lot, but frankly, we also want to give a lot. And that's what I have. Thank you, everybody.
Jack, incredible. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you all.
Very well
It's my family.
presented. We would expect nothing less from you, Jack. And I do want to also say, as Joni and I that resonates with us. I think virtually everything that Jack put on there, we have, and we also are still struggling. We're older, but we're still struggling with death plans, with those final arrangements. We kind of disagree on that, on some issues, and we're still working through those. And hopefully we'll both live long enough to come to some resolution. But if one of us goes first, the other one will just decide for us. But at least we've been talking about it. And that's part of this. It's going, so talking about it and making sure you're open about it. And our kids have been involved, as yours have, and are fully aware of this. Even some of our grandkids who are a little older were a little bit part of that discussion. So let's turn to the next generation, Ethan Grossman. Ethan, you're up.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to everyone for organizing this. If that last presentation was an absolute assurance that I wish Jack was in every group project I've ever had through my career and schooling, I don't know what is. I'm very impressive. So I apologize I don't have a 15-point plan on PowerPoint for everyone, but I thought I'd pick up a couple of the themes that Jack presented there and share a little bit of my family story, which is still pretty fresh. Tomorrow night actually marks the first yard site for my father passing away, and so some of this is still fresh in my mind. In preparing for the conversation tonight, I listened to Atul Gawande read his book again, and if you haven't read it or listened to it through Audible, I'd really recommend it. But the thing that stuck out in my mind from it, and I think that the rabbis talked about it, Jack has definitely talked about it, it's having the plan, having a goal in mind as to what things will look like. And really, to me, success towards the end of life, it looks very much like success throughout life, of knowing what it is you want, knowing what your goals are, knowing what are your core values, and then expressing that in the way you go. My first confrontation with that actually happened when I was 27. When I was 27, I was diagnosed with hairy cell leukemia, which my doctor told me was the type of leukemia you want to have. And thankfully, I was able to get over it fairly quickly. But I still remember sitting in the hospital room with my mom at my side, and just before starting chemo, the doctor said, "Listen, it's an easy chemo, but you never know what happens, and you need to talk to someone. You need to talk to whoever's going to make the decision if something happens to you." And at 27 years old, when to Jack's point, I was feeling immortal and nothing could impact me, I was faced very clearly with that mortality. And Rabbi, to your point, ice cream and a baseball game is definitely not enough for me. We discussed what those goals were, and I can tell you it was hard for me. I think it was even harder for my mom to hear, since she was the one that was going to have to act on it. But thankfully now my wonderful wife has those instructions. Along the way, as far as this planning goes, and the type of work that both Jack and the rabbi have been talking about, I actually went through a lot of the phases Jack talked about. My wife and I, we got married. We didn't feel the need for a will, but then we were pregnant with our first kid, and to Jack's point, it became quite pressing. And we have planned as if we are millionaires, even though we are not. Um, Although my insurance person will tell me I am definitely worth more dead than alive at this point in my career. But we do go through those plans. Um, I'm fortunate, given my profession, that I get to see my clients through many different stages, and it really prepared me actually with my dad as we went through some of the most difficult decisions to be made, because I was able to see some clients go through it themselves and hear the stories from them directly. Um, the other piece that was, I think, a strong preparation for all of this, for this journey that my family has gone through over an 18-year period, 17-year period, was that my father's health was one that was in. We knew we had borrowed time. My father had 2 liver transplants, and we knew that ultimately his life was not going to be as long as the rest of the families, just based on the statistics that were there. And I think it was actually helpful to my dad to know that, the the end of the calendar, to use the rabbi's analogy, was a point in the future that he could see more clearly than the beginning. So I remember throughout the years having some conversations with dad about these different end of life decisions. About once a year he was in the hospital, and for various complications or illnesses, and you had to confront these things on pretty much an annual basis. We were confronting something to this effect. Um, we never really sat down. The rabbi asked if we ever, sat down and had a formal conversation. We never really sat down and had a formal conversation the way maybe Jack and Arden did with their family. Um, but we did have conversations along the way, uh, meaningful conversations, and it may have been around things that were kind of circling around the topic. Like when my father and I had to take our beloved dog to be put down. I just remember each time we've done this with his dogs, with my dogs, he said, Ethan, at the end of the day, I wish we could do this on humans. I would much rather go that way than really suffer. Um, and so that was just something that always stuck with me. Then last summer, my father got, or I guess it was now almost 2 summers ago, summer of 2019, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer, and we knew that the time frame was shortening. Um, it's incredible, kind of all the things that Dr. Gawande talks about in the book, as far as where people's focus becomes when life becomes short, proved true for my dad. And when we got that diagnosis, I suggested we read the book, is between my mom and my dad, and they read it, and we were able to have a very meaningful conversation, and it helped to serve as a structure to talk about what are my dad's wishes. How does he want to go? What were his goals when things got very bad? And as we went through that, and ultimately got to the point where these decisions needed to be made, I personally felt prepared. I personally felt that the decisions that needed to be made were able to be made with clarity. We knew how much discomfort he was willing to undergo, how much dignity he was willing to lose. And when we got to those certain points, we were able to give the doctors the direction that we wanted to make. And I'll tell you, and Mom, I've mentioned this to you, in listening to the book again, it just was such an assurance to me that we made every decision the right way, even through to the end. And I take a lot of comfort in that, having read the book and recognizing that here was a guy where the author is a professional that is literally writing the book on it. And his father was a professional who fully recognized what he was going through. And even at the end, they had missteps. And the fact that I really don't feel like we did was because we were thoughtful, because we were prepared, and by some, I would say, holy force, the different family members dealing with the different issues were able to kind of take charge and run forward. I come from a family, I would say we're a mixed family in religiosity. Um, my brother is a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi. My sister is also Baal Tshuva, though not as observant as my brother, but close. And then you have my mom, my dad, and myself who follow the Glickstein version of Judaism. And my brother was able to take charge and speak to the resources he had at hand to deal with what we knew my dad wanted, a traditional Jewish burial, and he was able to handle all of that. I was able to work with my mom to help my father at the end and make the health decisions that both my sister and my brother just wouldn't have had the emotional strength to make. And we're very fortunate that we have a large family around. My uncle Ira was helpful in a number of the arrangements. Rabbi Davis, Rabbi Pomerantz, Mark Baranek, so many other people came in when it came to getting certain arrangements made, and it was very helpful. So it was very comforting in that regard. And it really was, to Jack's final point in talking about this idea of Lador Vador and planned giving and things like that. It really was just a great comfort to know that I've got such a great community around me and around my family. And I know Marjorie brought this up at the beginning. It was not our intent almost a decade ago when Leah and I made a planned gift through our retirement accounts to the synagogue. And my mother and father made a planned gift through their estate plan in their will, in their revocable trusts. It was not on our mind at that time, when everyone was healthy and doing well, that this was what would perpetuate us from generation to generation. But watching the community come together, our clergy and our friends from the temple come together, ultimately, after my father passed and those first few days of difficulty, of just the sadness, the structure holding us up, keeping us from falling all the way down, it ultimately was our community. It was our synagogue. It was our friends. It was our family from all around that provided that. And so it made me even more proud to have planned for the synagogue in our plan, and have that aid throughout these journeys with us.
Thank you, Ethan. That was beautiful. And I know I see Anita's on, and our hearts go out to you and your family. All those 18 years were a lot of ups and a lot of downs. But you as a family were always there. And Elliot, kept fighting and stayed in the game as long as he could. And in that way, you were blessed even through all of those trials. You are one of those interesting families that goes through the Reform movement and ends up being religiously across the spectrum. Ethan's mother-in-law is a cantor for a Reform congregation. So when we talk about, they talked about the new vice president as being a modern family, blended modern family. Well, from a religious standpoint, that's what your family is. In many ways, it's not that Reform necessarily leads to assimilation. It can lead in all kinds of different directions. And your family is really one of those that demonstrates that, in the way that you all find a way to practice together and still remain a family. I know this is too raw for Anita to say anything. I just didn't know if you could comment on your parents. Did they ever talk to you, the Gillers, about any of these issues, or your brothers?
Well, my parents had an estate plan. We were very involved in when they were preparing it. They had all the children involved in the preparation of the estate plan. My parents bought plots many years ago. We have a family plot in Mount Nebo, and so there's enough plots for me, and that's where Elliot is, and my brothers and their spouses, and I think now we have enough plots for our children. But and they also bought the pre-burial package that they had at Levitt Weinstein, so that we didn't have to go and pick out a casket. We didn't have to do figure out, you know, the limousines. We didn't have to do anything. It was all written out and in the agreement, in the contract that they had prearranged. And both my parents had wills. Both of them, you know, left. My parents were always very philanthropic, and part of their wills also included donations for philanthropy. And it did make everything much easier, the fact that they had everything planned out in advance, so we knew. We also knew that they didn't want to, what their health directives were, and that they didn't want to be a vegetable. If that was going to be the situation, they wanted, you know, the doctors to make them as comfortable as possible. So it was clear we didn't necessarily have a specific meeting, except when they were doing the estate planning with the attorneys. We met once or twice after they had everything worked out as how they wanted it. And we pretty much just went in and signed all the papers. But so that was part of the plan. And Elliot and I have done the same thing. And a lot of, probably because of Elliot's health issues, we were sure to have wills and health surrogates clear and health directives clear, so that there wouldn't be any misunderstanding or difficulties as a result. So.
Right. You know, your parents, that generation, I dealt with a lot of that generation when I came to Beth Shalom, as I was the young rabbi, and they were, you know, my age now, but you know, it's, and there were many of them of that generation that wouldn't buy plots, that wouldn't talk about any end of life issues, that wouldn't even, they thought it was bad luck to even deal with that. So it was kind of unusual of that generation for your parents to have really thought through many of these things, that even today it's hard for many of my generation to still kind of be open about this and have these kind of conversations.
I just add, part of why my parents did have a plot was, and a big plot, was because my father did some work for Mount Nebo, and in exchange for the work, they gave him a bunch of plots. So that's how he acquired them.
He was the architect for Mount Nebo?
I think for the Mausoleum area, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in those days, barter was very common.
Very common.
Right. I don't know if anybody wanted to, we have a few minutes. If anybody wants to ask or have any sharing or something that you want to add to this conversation as we're drawing toward a conclusion. Anybody want to jump in here at this point? Anita's, you can unmute it, Anita.
Okay.
There.
One of the things I think that a lot of us might not consider, and I'm talking about this because I have a family member who's in this situation now. He was very healthy all his life, has no real health issues, had developed Alzheimer's, And now he's in a position where, he really can't do anything on his own. And his health directive is that he doesn't want to be in this situation. If he was in this situation and he was on medicine, they would consider, not having the medicine and things like that. But he's not on any medicine. And that's something we need to think about. If you're a healthy individual, yet you don't, and you're in that state, then what?
Right. Well, and we don't have active euthanasia. What Ethan talked about with the dogs. I felt that way when we had a cat for like 19 years, and when Joni and I and Jesse, we went there to put the cat down. It was so peaceful and without pain. And it was like, yeah, why can't we have that? But we don't. Our society is not yet at that stage. There are a few states that have it. There are a few countries that allow euthanasia and active euthanasia. And the reality is, it's kind of, you have to wait till a person like that gets to a crisis, health crisis. And then the question is, you don't have to treat it. If it's pneumonia, you don't have to give medication. If it, there are ways to keep someone, as you know, out of pain through hospice or palliative care without having to be active. And that's also part of the decision-making. There are a number of books about end of life, about having a good death. Good death means as close as you can to the kind of death that you envision for yourself when you think about it. Everybody wants to die at old age in their sleep, perfectly healthy. Actually, there's a Yiddish phrase that Rabbi Jolt used to say, and that is, you should die an old man in your sleep. I should die healthy, is the phrase in Yiddish. You should die healthy. Well, we usually don't get that choice. It's very few people where that happens. Periodically, we see it. Many of us will get a choice to make. Do we have to operate at a certain stage if it's not going to really give us any more quality of life? Do we have to go through a medical procedure? Or do we have to treat a cancer if it's not going to necessarily bring us back to the state we want to be in? So thinking through that is all part of that end of life. And we know that Alzheimer's and dementia are issues because we're living longer. And so many of us, as we live longer, we have normal memory loss. I certainly do. I don't know how many times a day I can't think of something that I know is sitting in my brain. And it's frustrating, but it's normal loss. The quote I think I use is one I heard someone say: if you forget where your keys are, that's normal. If you don't know what your keys do, that's dementia. That is, you're moving into a direction where you've lost the notion of what it means to use a key. So, but moving in that, what do you do with that? Well, thinking it through and talking about it are kind of what we're dealing with here. So, we are, as with Jack and Ethan and many of you, Joni and I have also committed not only to Temple, but to those places, just as Jack went through, that have mattered to us, that we've been active in. And also those places like my alma mater that ordained me as a rabbi, that has given me this life, which is such a blessed life, and allowed me to be a rabbi. Be able to leave something for the next generation of rabbinical students, and to be able to help them, not just our children and grandchildren, but to try and leave some kind of legacy for the places that have mattered, including, of course, Beth Shalom and Federation and NCJW, and those places for us that are important. So obviously, this is a program that's meant to stimulate thought, and I hope that it has helped Some of you, if you want to contact me, you know how to contact me through the temple. I haven't changed my email since I first got it. It's still AOL, so it's easy to find. And I'm going to turn this back over to Michael Dribman, I believe, who will continue our program. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, Jack and Ethan. I thought this was a fantastic program, and I thank obviously the Rabbi, but Jack and Ethan, thank you for your very thoughtful presentations. I found them to be really, I'm somewhat familiar with some of these issues, and I found your presentations to be really enlightening. I thought about things I hadn't really focused on. And in that regard, this program is being videotaped. So if you have friends or family members who you think it would be useful to have a look at this, by all means, get in touch with Katie at the temple and arrange. Or I guess you can just go online. It's probably, you can get it at our website. And by the way, I also wanted to touch on one sort of particular point that Jack made in terms of, when he had his medical emergency and, the medical care providers were asking him whether he had these documents in place. The time to do those documents is not when you're in an ambulance on the way to the ER. The time to do it is in the process that Jack described and Rabbi described and Ethan described, in a thoughtful process where you have the time, you're not under pressure. And it drives me a little bit crazy, frankly, when hospitals, and I've been a patient at a hospital, throw at you as one of their admissions pieces of paper for you to sign, things like a living will and a healthcare surrogate. And these are legal documents. They're not, that have, as we've been just talking about, have very serious and important implications. And you should not be considering those things for the first time under those circumstances. And as a corollary of that, if you've done those documents, it is not enough to put them in a drawer somewhere and wipe your hands and say, I've taken care of that. You've got to make your primary healthcare providers aware of the existence of these documents, give them copies. If there is pass them around so that if an emergency does arise or circumstances arise, they're in possession of this stuff. So it doesn't do any good just to sign them and forget about them and think you don't have to do anything with it. And the other point I wanted to focus on has been touched on by all of our speakers tonight, and that is this concept of Lador next generation and the importance of that. Just as, each generation, all of us on this Zoom session have benefited from the activities and the work and the generosity of the generation that came before us, both in supporting and establishing and making thrive not only Temple Beth Shalom, but so many other charitable organizations. And so I think this concept is one that's sort of incumbent on each generation to see to it that there's assistance provided to the next generation, the generations beyond that. And so that's where this concept of planned giving can really come into play. And I'm really glad to see that Jack and Ethan have been so thoughtful about this, and Jack and Arden have talked to their kids about it and explained it. So I would encourage you to give some thought about that kind of gift, naming the temple in some way. Katie Boyzak would be happy to talk to you about how it might be done and some of the opportunities. And don't think that this has to be on a grand, very expensive or large scale basis. Do it within your means, but consider doing it as part of this process of considering end of life issues. I'd encourage you to do that. And by the way, sort of along the lines of this whole general conversation, some very important events, of course, occurred today in Washington, D.C. But for my wife, Lori, and me, today was important for other reasons, because we got our first Social Security checks deposited in our accounts. The first ones of our life. And all I could do was think back to when I was like a teenager and had my first jobs in which Social Security was deducted from my paycheck. And here we are 50 years later, whatever it is, finally getting something back. So
You're not old enough to get that.
what's that?
You're not old enough to get that.
Well, the government thinks we are, so I'll accept it. And one other thing, I'm thinking of sort of practical things here. Discussion, I think Jack said, and Ethan is taking care of this, cemetery plots. I believe I'm correct, I may be speaking out of school, that Temple Beth Shalom still has some plots available at Lakeside. And if you contact our executive director, Jeff Graff, he'll be able to give you information. So if you're considering needs in that regard, do it through the temple because you'll get a discounted price for that. Well, my wife and I have done that through the temple. So that's my pitch. For this. If you enjoy this event, and we've been having terrific events, this series has been, I think, very meaningful. There's a ton of activities available through the temple. If you just go to our website for upcoming events, tbsnb.org, you'll see the whole list of things. And again, I want to thank everyone, Rabbi and Jack and Ethan and Anita, for their participation and their input into what I found to be a very important program. So unless anybody else has anything else they want to add, I think we are adjourned.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks,
You're welcome.
Ethan, Anita, Margie.
Thank you all. Good
Thank you
night.
all.
Everybody.
Safe evening.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Stay safe.
Thank,